I thank you all for coming. I'm surprised and humbled to see so many of you here, particularly my family. I would have gladly just let you look at the PowerPoint at the house, but I'm glad you're here. Believe it or not, this is being recorded, and I will say for the record that I appreciate the hundreds of you that are here and the thousands upon thousands who are watching this on live stream on Facebook, and that's the truth. My son Brian Oakley, hi Brian, has made arrangements with Tim Flanagan to have this live streamed on Facebook, so we're all over the country. You never know when Tim's going to swing that camera around and pan the audience, so behave yourselves. I have never made this presentation. I have no idea how long it's going to last. So let's go with this plan. I'll do the talking, you all do the listening. If you get through listening before I get through talking, let me know. It may go, but I do understand the library closes at 8 o'clock, so that'll give you something to look forward to. I have literally been putting this together for 56 years. There are photographs here that I took with a Polaroid land camera in 1960. Who remembers Polaroid land cameras? Oh my goodness. Well, I did, and they're here, and I'm glad I took them, and I'm glad I saved them, and I wish I'd have saved all of them. Danny Cook took a picture of me laying in a casket in about 1960. My mother got a hold of the picture. She didn't like it. I don't understand. And she told me years later she threw it away, so sorry you don't get to see that. But here's the rest of it. I'm going to explain briefly a little bit about funeral service in general, and then I'm going to get specific about Bristol. And we'll come back to a photograph similar to this shortly. This is not an unusual photograph, believe it or not. It's not an unusual happening.
Did you take that one, Sid?
I did not take that with Tim, but thanks for asking. This is a common scene in America. I started to say rural America. It was a common scene in America. This photograph was taken in Bristol. I don't have the family's permission nor the star of the photograph's permission to tell you who they are, so I won't. But it is a local photograph. It's back in the day, which lasted up into the 60s. This is not absolutely unheard of now, of taking the deceased home. There were times when the family would build the casket, where when embalming became a practice, it was done in the home. The wake was held in the home, or the receiving of friends, and the funeral was sometimes held in the home or in the church, and burial in whatever cemetery the family used. And it wasn't unusual to take photographs of this because it was a keepsake, a historical record of the death of a valued and beloved family member, and also the survivors. I don't think these guys are dead. I think this photograph is staged, but during the Civil War, I don't think they would be standing up so nicely if they were, or their hands would be here, they'd just be. But anyway, while embalming was done a little throughout the country prior to the Civil War, it became done extensively during the Civil War. Not that every casualty was embalmed and sent home, because they weren't, but many were. And when families received the remains of loved ones who had died in the war, weeks, sometimes months after their death, and saw the condition in which these bodies had been preserved, they were amazed because that's not what they were accustomed to seeing. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, it took 13 days to get him from Washington to Springfield for his burial. And literally hundreds of thousands of people saw his body. They were amazed at the condition of his body, which had been embalmed by 2 surgeons in Washington. So people were seeing something that they'd never seen before. I'm going to show you all a generic photograph of a furniture store which offered coffins and caskets, and down here it says undertakers, and I don't know what it says over here, but this could have just as well been in Bristol. Basically, anybody that could make furniture could build a casket or a coffin, as they were called back then, and as they were back then. There were several furniture companies or cabinet makers in Bristol whose ads can be found in old city directories and other publications that showed that they offered drapery material, furniture, carpet, funerals, embalming, undertaker services, coffins and caskets, right here on State Street. I don't have a picture and don't know of a picture or photograph of one of these establishments on State Street back in the day. There are pictures of buildings that were used for those purposes, and I'll get to that in a minute. I think the next photograph is the one I want to play a little game with. Does everybody here know what a basket case is? What's a basket case, Martha? Me?
Difficult to deal with. I don't know.
Something difficult to deal with is a basket case. What up,
It's a call.
Nancy? Well, I'll get back to you in a minute. Give her a free something over there. What other definitions are there of basket case? You don't have to be nice. Don't worry about
Someone
Barbara.
that's really nervous and upset.
You're exactly right. Someone that's nervous and upset, may be mentally unbalanced. Being a car appreciator, I see ads about cars that confesses that they're basket cases. They're a bunch of parts that have to be restored and put back together. But Nancy Cook Hyde knows
Wow.
the origin of the term basket case, because if you were a basket case,
$27.
it says ambulance basket. I don't believe that, because if it were an ambulance basket, why would it have a lid on it? I think it was a hearse basket. And I've seen one of these at Webb Funeral Home in Spruce Pine, North Carolina. It's the only one I've ever seen. But it's a wicker basket. And the one there at Webb is over 100 years old, but it's still in very good condition.
Wow.
But I did want to show you the true meaning of the
What is that?
frame basket case.
What was the price of that?
We should have bought a bunch of them, $27 without the lid and $46 with the lid. The primary reason for funeral homes as we know them today is a sad fact, and that is the flu epidemic of 1918, which affected Bristol, practically the world. But when people got the flu, they were very, very contagious. Even when they died, they remained contagious. People wanted to get the deceased flu victims out of their homes. The undertakers were willing to come to the homes and remove the bodies and take them to their places of business. In Bristol, In 1918, they were all furniture stores. They had storage rooms in the back. That's where they took them. And they buried them rather quickly. And the undertakers were esteemed by the communities for their willingness to take this risk, because the undertakers too caught the flu. And some of them died. I don't know of any in Bristol, but they most definitely did throughout the country. So, the growth of the acceptance of embalming, the death of President Lincoln and hundreds of thousands of people that saw his embalmed body, the influenza epidemic of 1918, all led to the establishment of funeral homes that began to appear as they basically are today. And strangely enough, within 5 years after the flu epidemic of 1918, funeral homes began to open all over the country, including Bristol, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I'll show you two photographs here that I think we're mighty lucky to have preserved. This is in East Hill Cemetery, right up here at the head of town. I don't know who took it. I don't know when they took it. I don't know how it has been preserved, but it's a pretty good photograph. There's the horse-drawn hearse. There's the family wagon and other wagons that are coming up. But I think it's important to notice all the people that are already at the cemetery, because they walked up the hill faster than those carriages could make it up the hill. And they didn't want to walk behind them because they knew how slow it was going to be. So if the funeral were at a church downtown or at a home, they just walked on up the hill. But that is, in fact, the East Hill Cemetery here in Bristol. I don't know whose hearse that is, and I don't know who the men on it are. I wish I did, but maybe somebody someday will volunteer to tell me. Here's another photograph taken at East Hill Cemetery. This is apparently a World War I casualty. And you'll see that looks very much like a horse-drawn hearse, if you know what a horse-drawn hearse looks like. And it probably used to be. But the first motorized hearses were simply horse-drawn hearses, which had the body of the hearse removed and put on a truck chassis. The first motorized hearse built for that purpose, marketed and sold for that purpose, was in 1916. Well, it's obvious here. Beg pardon? I thought maybe 1916.
16.
No, wait a minute. Yeah, right, 1916. I doubt seriously if there was a funeral home in Bristol. Well, there wasn't a funeral home in Bristol. That there was a furniture store willing to make the investment they would have had to make in that motorized hearse. So they either sent their horse-drawn hearse to a carriage factory and had it modified into a motorized hearse, or they did it themselves, which wasn't unusual at all. Now let's begin to broach the beginnings of funeral homes as we know them today. This is the family of A.S. McNeil at their home on Moore Street, not far from here, right up the hill. Captain McNeil came here from Tazewell County in the 1870s after the Civil War. He was a captain in the Confederate Army. He was a furniture maker, cabinet maker, and apparently fairly well-to-do, because he rented a furniture store on State Street in 1879, bought out the two undertakers that were practicing in Bristol at that time. I didn't mean to say the two of the undertakers that were practicing at that time. He had a very large family. Wrong button. This son and George and this son Tobias helped their father, Captain McNeil, in the furniture and undertaking business that was on State Street. Captain McNeil built that building in 1889, so it's a very old building. And the reason it looks familiar to you is because it houses William King Clothiers and Goodman's Jewelers. But it was built as A.S. McNeil and Son Furniture and Undertaking Company. I've been upstairs. There are tall ceilings, very large rooms. The furniture store was downstairs. The undertaking department was on the second floor, and the third floor is where the attendants or clerks or what have you slept at night, because it was 24-hour day service, as funeral homes are today. The McNeil family, in spite of their size, did not continue the operation of this business on any long-term basis. Tobias moved out of here and started a printing company in Bristol. George continued to operate the furniture store, but the funeral home was bought by other people, the names of whom I don't know, and moved on to Broad Street in a house that I've never seen a picture of. I know that Hubert and Ollie Hicks at one time became the owners of the funeral home on Broad Street, and they eventually moved to this house on Anderson Street, which I remember. Who else remembers this house on Anderson Street? That was McNeil Funeral Home until Fred Weaver bought it in 1947. Fred Weaver had worked at Acre Funeral Home on James Street, which we'll get to here shortly, and Huff Cook Funeral Home on Pennsylvania Avenue, and Paul Cook Funeral Home when the name of that place was changed. And Paul Cook told me himself that he was driving the hearse. No, Fred Weaver was driving the hearse. Paul Cook was riding with him as they returned from a funeral at Glenwood Cemetery. It was during that trip that Fred Weaver told Paul Cook he was buying McNeil Funeral Home, which I'm sure was a hard thing for Fred Weaver to do. And it probably wasn't a good thing for Paul Cook to hear. But if you knew Paul Cook's personality, I believed him when he told me that Mr. Weaver said, "Paul, I'm not just going to quit and run out on you. I'll give you all the notice you need, a month or whatever you need." He said, "We were coming up Woodlawn Avenue, some of which is now Martin Luther King Boulevard." Paul Cook said, I said, "Fred, if you'll just pull the hearse over here and let me drive, you can just walk over there. It's just 2 blocks. So they didn't part the best of friends and really never were. But I want to mention quickly, this is mentioned in the ad that I kind of cut and pasted and made into what you're seeing as their chapel with private family room. Now I've carried a little over 10,000 of those folding funeral home chairs in my life. That's the old bent wood chairs. But it caught my attention when it said private family room. Funeral homes began to advertise private family rooms. Well, the fact is, in these old homes in which they began to locate funeral homes, the largest room in the house, which I suppose is usually the living room, was the chapel. Well, if they didn't have room in the chapel for all the people that came, they stuck the family off to the side in the dining room and called it the private family room. And then they began to advertise that. While I've never been in this place, I imagine down the hall here there's a dining room probably right there that was the private family room. Strangely enough, though these places of business were called funeral homes, none of the first funeral parlors or funeral locations in Bristol were in old homes. And today there's only 2. So Bristol's been a little different in that respect. In 1956, Fred Weaver bought the Caldwell Mansion on Locust Street, corner of 7th, and converted it into a funeral home. They're still there, and that is one of the 2 firms in Bristol that operate out of buildings, any part of which were ever private family residences. Does anybody know the other one?
Baker.
Right. Who said that?
Baker.
Joyce, you don't get to answer any more questions.
I've heard this.
But that is a beautiful place. Coincidentally, my parents lived there when they got married. They rented an apartment in that place. I guess that's when I first began to be weird. How many people remember Fred Weaver? A lot of us. He was a fine person, had a full head of white hair, unlike other people who don't have a full head of white hair. Randy Bowers, probably all of us knew. Fred Weaver began to build a really fine funeral service operation up here on Locust Street. But he was only in that house 5 years. He died at the age of 57 in 1961. 57 years old. You see how life takes the life of a funeral director takes its toll on young people. Randy Bowers went to work at Weaver Funeral Home when he was in high school, about a little bit after the time I went to work at Paul Cook Funeral Home. And while I'm told in the 70s, after Mr. Weaver's death, there were 14 stockholders at Weaver Funeral Home. Randy set out and accomplished buying all the stock, and at one time did own all the stock in the funeral home. He later, sold stock in the funeral home to Tom Barnett, who worked with Randy for many years and is still there. Randy died after a long battle with cancer about 5 years ago. Yeah, it was 5 years ago. He was a fine person. We got along great, never had ill words except one time. That's too long a story to get into. But we got over it. We went out to lunch and got over it. Here's Weaver Funeral Home today. In 1973, the owners, such as they were then, built a chapel onto the funeral home. The funeral home, I don't think, bless its old heart, has gone 6 months without some sort of renovation over the years. And it is nice. It's lended itself very well to the operation of the funeral home. So let's see where we go from here. In 1922, a fella from Johnson City, Tennessee named Shep Williams, S-H-E-P-P-E, opened a funeral home on Moore Street at 111 Moore Street in a building that was built by Southern Made Creamery across the street and down one lot from Jack Trayer's restaurant on Moore Street. I doubt if you can see this, so I'll tell you that this says Shep Williams is the president, J.A. Flanagan, vice president, N.D. Presley. A lot of us knew N.D. the third, my age. Second vice president, J.B. Akard, secretary treasurer. J.B. Akard started working at Dewey Bayless Furniture Store on State Street in the year 1900. And became an undertaker, and when it became required for undertakers to be licensed, he went to Nashville, worked at a funeral home in Nashville called Gutman. I would never have named my funeral home Gutman. But he did. I also know of a funeral home named Deadman. Look it up on the internet, spelled Dead Man. I would have called it Evergreen Hills or something. Shep Williams started this business in 1922 and operated there about 5 years. And I base all this on what I've been told by people that thought they knew what they were telling me, and I'm telling you what I think I remember about what they thought they remembered what they told me. And also, I've checked all these dates in the city directory. The problem with city directories is they're always a year behind. So you don't know in what part of the previous year they got the information and when the directory came out. So I do know that this firm started doing business in 1922, making it the first funeral home in Bristol built solely for the purpose of a funeral home. Then we can see in I happen to know, trust me, that in 1927 the name changed to Bristol Funeral Home. Same address, 111 Moore Street. But now you see Mr. Williams' name is no longer there. Mr. Presley's the president, Mr. Flanagan's vice president, J.B. Akert is still secretary treasurer. By the way, J.B. Akert was the father of David Akert Sr., the father of David, who was the father of Dave Jr., who's Melinda's husband. That's his claim to fame. Melinda Akert's husband, just like I'm Joyce.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
These older establishments, are there any business records for
Yes,
them?
ma'am. Yes. Blevins has beautiful records from 1928. Akert has pretty good records from 1933. Unfortunately, when Fred Weaver bought McNeil Funeral Home in 1947, he didn't get the records. But they've just never been discovered in modern times. I mean, I'm talking back in the 60s, they weren't available. I can't imagine why they didn't go with the business. But there's all those records prior to 1947 from 1889 that are gone.
Poor shame.
Specifically from a genealogical point of view, is why I'm asking. But places like Bristol Funeral Home that no longer exist, are there?
I think Akert has, why I don't know, because as you'll see in a minute, Akert's the one that left that location on Moore Street. But I think they have some Bristol Funeral Home records.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So, Bristol Funeral Home operated about a year, and then it became, surprisingly to a lot of people, Blevins Akert Funeral Home, still at 111 Moore Street. Now Mr. Akert is still the secretary treasurer, but R. Leslie Blevins is the president. So, a lot of us in here know Bob Blevins, who's Bob's probably 103. Something like that. He and I think that his grandfather gave his father the money to buy that funeral home because he wasn't even working there prior to the name change. And now suddenly it's Blevins first, and he's the president. Blevins Akert Funeral Home began on April 1st, 1928. That's where Blevins records start, and they are complete. Still at 111 Moore Street, which I think I've said about 3 times. Thank goodness David Akert Jr. had this photograph. And I figure, and he didn't argue with me, that that's his dad right here, David Akert, David Weaver Akert. And that's Haskell Weaver, who was the longtime manager of Glenwood, Shelby Hills, and Mountain View cemeteries. Jackie, raise your hand. Jackie's daddy. I'm not going to try to tell how that Weaver Akert thing works. I would if you weren't here. You can see that says Blevins Acre Funeral. The other signs, it said Williams, Bristol, that says Blevins Acre. That car, I don't know what it says. I think the funniest thing about this photograph is, you got Haskell Weaver, David Acre, and then you got these 4 police officers on their motorcycles. Now, they're just Bristol, Virginia police officers. Somebody said, hey, come over to the funeral home, we're gonna take a picture. And then you got this guy right here leaning on this car. I don't have a clue who that is. It looks like he's got on a t-shirt and a leather jacket. Anyway, he got in the picture. Now, I'm going to tell you briefly, this funeral home was connected to Southern Make Creamery. And then it was connected by this archway to Central Presbyterian Church, which you all grew up in. Do you remember that church? No, excuse me for insulting you. Well, I do. And it looked good to have that archway there. This funeral home is tiny, but remember, the only funerals they had in funeral homes were people that didn't have a decent sized home and didn't go to church. They didn't have visitations and funerals in funeral homes back in 1928 to 33 like they do now. So it was adequate. I've been told by those that remembered the building that there were times that it was very small. This funeral home did a whole lot of business. Yes, ma'am.
What street was that?
111 Moore Street.
Seal.
Williams, Bristol, Blevins Acre, all 111 Moore Street, all owned by the Creamery. Dave Acre Jr. had this picture, even though I have since found it in a book I've got. This is a 1931 Cadillac town car ambulance, and you can see right there it says Blevins Acre on the door. I increased the size of that nameplate, lost a lot of detail, but I just wanted you to be able to see it says Blevins Acre. In today's dollars, that was probably the most expensive automobile that has ever driven the streets of this town. It's got an open driver's compartment with a pull-out lid for inclement weather. Got side mounts, they call them, with chrome covers. It's got lead glass windows in the back. Now this is an ambulance. Up front, that's a siren right there. Wire wheels on 6 wire wheels on the car, 4 on the ground and 2 on the side ones. It was white with navy blue details on the fenders and the very expensive automobile. I'm sure they just wore it out and traded it in for something. That's it. Some smaller funeral home bought it and it eventually was driven or towed to a junkyard. In 1933, Blevins and Acre split for various reasons I've heard, but I don't know, so it doesn't matter. That happened a long time ago. How many remember the awful looking greenhouse across from Emmanuel Episcopal Church up here on Cumberland and James Street? That's it. That picture was probably taken in 1940 or 41. But he made a nice funeral home. Here's Dave Sr. with his 1940 Packard ambulance. Dave Sr. was a hot dog. He really was. He was a showboat. And he apparently was that way all his life. I'm not saying that derogatorily. I just thought the world of it. I just kind of want to be just like him. But that's the kind of thing he liked, and that's the kind of thing he offered the public. This is Acre Funeral Home there on James Street, and this is such a good representation of what funeral homes were back in the day. This is a slumber room. I've seen ads of Acre Funeral Home, 6 private slumber rooms. Well, the reason they were called slumber rooms is because they had a bed in them. And it was customary back then, when the family came to the funeral home to select the casket and make the arrangements, the first time they saw the deceased embalmed, not yet dressed, but covered with these spreads, was on the daybed. These drapes right here, and I guarantee you there hadn't a funeral home ever thrown away a set of those Jack-in-the-Box drapes. Every funeral home in town's got a set. Totally worthless, hadn't been used in years, but nobody wants to throw them away. They fold down into a box about this long and about a foot high and a foot wide, and you carried them when you took a body home, and you put them in front of the fireplace or a window or whatever less than aesthetically pleasing place to put the casket in front of. And they're maroon velvet. I never saw any that weren't maroon velvet. Some had gold on them. But I want to show you what people, see that lamp?
What time period is that? Approximate?
35 to 40. Maybe, all right, that Packard ambulance was a 40 model. They might have taken these pictures the same day. I'm sure it was new, or they would have been. I've got 5 or 6 pictures of that ambulance in different poses with different people standing around it. But that lamp, that's a torch shear, a casket lamp we call it. This love seat, those drapes, they didn't have enough furniture to go around. And there's those lamp, there's a lamp again, there's the drape. No, it's not the same drapes. There's the love seat, there's that table. No, it isn't. Anyway, I've done that too when I'm taking pictures in the funeral home. I'll say, oh, that's a pretty piece of furniture. I want that in every room here when we take the picture. I figure this is half of their casket selection room. Photographer's probably got that many again to his back. That's still anchored on James Street. You can see that that was probably 2 or 3 rooms because of the different ceiling levels. They were there from 1933 to 1951. I shouldn't have put Stone Castle there and let you all guess where that is. Most of us would know. That is the Tennessee High School football stadium. Good place to take a picture of a fleet of cars. There's that same white Packard ambulance, 1940 model. That's a 41 Packard combination car as opposed to a 1939 Packard straight hearse. And by that I mean, surely you all know funeral homes used to provide ambulance services for the communities. And Bristol did until midnight, June 30th, 1977. It was simply that the coaches that they used for funerals were also conducive to ambulance service. Now, this is a straight ambulance, and I'll show you another 1 or 2, 3, in that it could not be converted into a hearse in less than a week or 2. It's got red lights bolted on it and sirens, and here's a siren on the roof. But this is a combination. See that? I don't know if you can tell, that's a cross right there. And that panel came out of that window when they wanted to use it for a funeral. This is a straight hearse. It doesn't have that kind of panel. That's a LaSalle, probably family car, a Chevrolet coupe to lead funerals with, and some kind of flower van. J.B. Akard was the J.B. Akard I pointed out on those letterheads. Started in funeral service in 1900. I think he died in 1945. David Akard Sr., who died in 1973. There's the artist's rendering of what Akard Funeral Home used to look like. There is the residence around which it was built. That's a straight ambulance. See the tunnel lights built into the roof? and that's a combination car. They can take that light off the top, use it for an ambulance or a hearse. Thought it was interesting. Y'all remember the Tennessee license plates? Shaped like the state of Tennessee? That's Acres Chapel, dedicated in 1953. Every funeral home had a room that they called the chapel. Acres was the first one in Bristol to have a church-type chapel with pews. When Acres Funeral Home moved out on West State Street, and when they finally finished that chapel a couple of years later, there was no contest between what they had on West State Street and what the other funeral homes had to offer. It took the other funeral homes a long time to come close to catching up. Whether or not they ever have would be a difference of opinion between me and the Acres and some others. Acres horse-drawn hearse prior to the 1956 Bristol Centennial Parade. There's First Christian Church up on the hill above the railroad tracks. There's St. Anne Catholic Church Sanctuary, which later became Gillespie and Robinson Funeral Home. Those three houses are gone now. That is the Family Life Center of, does this mean you're tired of listening?
I've heard you long enough.
I understand. I knew he'd get up and leave just so he could say something like that. Of course, First Christian Church is still there. I've heard this hearse came out of Benham's, Virginia. Why anybody in Benham's, Virginia would have a horse-drawn hearse, I don't have a clue. But it was used in the parade. I remember it sitting out to the left of Acres Chapel for a few years, and then it was in the garage for a few years, and then Dave Jr. said somebody came along and wanted to buy it, and he sold it. But by that time, the wheels were off of it. I remember seeing just the body sitting on the floor in the garage. But it was nice for the centennial. Acres Fleet, 1964. Here again, for what it's worth to y'all, that's a straight hearse, straight ambulance with the lights built into the roof and so forth, and a combination coach. Take that light off right there. You know, the only other thing you had to do is there were rollers in the floor for the casket. They flipped over so that they weren't rollers, they were just a solid piece of chrome for ambulance work. That's Acres Funeral Home today. The basic difference, in 1966 they built this new entrance and spruced the place up. It's a shame in that photograph you can't see the other A-frame over here, but as I think we all know, there are three. Back to Moore Street. It was Williams Funeral Home, it was Bristol Funeral Home, it was Blevins Acres Funeral Home, and in 1933 it became Blevins Funeral Home. And, strangely enough, I knew these four people, but I never did know these three. But I know that's Ray Blevins, who was the brother to R. Leslie Blevins, who was the owner of the funeral home and the father of Bob Blevins, whom many of us know, and grandfather of Bobby Blevins. George and Dare Loving, and my old-time and wonderful friend, R.E. Smith, who was at Blevins Funeral Home for over 50 years. He lived in 3 Blevins funeral homes. And he and his wife were dear friends of mine. And I had the privilege of working with R.E. Well, we helped each other a little bit over the years, but actually working with him the last few years of his life. In 1953, Blevins lost their lease on the building on Moore Street that was owned by Southern Made Creamery. And they had to quickly find another place in which to operate their funeral home. And they looked around and finally bought this house at 417 Lee Street, in which they planned to be for maybe a year while they built a funeral home or found another building that would be suitable for funeral home use. There's no Blevins people in here, is there? Acres, no acres. It was a perfect storm for Acre Funeral Home. They had just moved out on West State Street and dedicated their chapel in 1953. Their biggest competitor is Blevins. Blevins loses their lease on their funeral home and move into that place. Nothing that good ever happened to me. And I remember that house very well. It had a round foyer, 4 rooms. The casket selection was in the basement. Ari and Billy Smith lived upstairs, and then you could go on up on the 3rd floor. There never was anything up there but emptiness. But that turret was kind of neat to look at. It was paneled with walnut and so forth. And their business went down so fast they couldn't afford to get out of this place. So they operated there for almost 11 years. And then Bob Blevins hated funeral work. Hated it. And his dad died in 1964, and he and his mother sold the funeral home as quickly as they possibly could to 3 longtime employees, Charlie Copenhagen, R.E. Smith, and Jess Strinkle. And Bob rode off into the, he may have run off into the sunset.
Yes.
And never looked back. But I enjoy visiting with Bob, and he has a lot of fond memories and other kind of memories of this place. But I'm gonna, okay, all right. Here's Blevins' 1949 green Buick ambulance and their black 1950 Buick hearse. I remember those 2 cars. I took this picture right here in 1960, the day that they, well, not the day, but they had bought the white Cadillac, 53 Cadillac, and still had the 49 green Buick, and I took a terrible picture. I took a better picture that day, I'll show you. But since that picture, I wanted you to get a better picture of that ambulance. It is rudely blocked. But that's R.E. in his black and white shoes. And that's Kyle Weaver, who was Sullivan County Sheriff. I remember him. Know some of you do. Zoe, you came back just in time, buddy.
What year was that?
That's 1961. That's the first race at Bristol International Speedway. And she was, John, what was she? Miss Pure Oil or something. I bet you do. I sure hate that she's in that picture. You'd have a better picture of that ambulance. Now, why? This funeral home's brand new. Why they would take the picture on that day is beyond me, and it's the only one they got that I've ever seen of that building until later years. But that was the new funeral home behind the old funeral home at 417 Lee Street. They built the new funeral home, tore the old funeral home down. For several years operated with gravel parking lot. I don't guess snow was always on the roof, but it probably looked better with the snow on it. But it wasn't a bad place. But it's the only place I ever had that had Queen Anne Naugahyde furniture. Didn't it, Joyce? I promise you. Naugahyde Queen Anne furniture. This is Blevins' funeral home today. You can see the right side of the building has an addition that was added in 1974. It's now the chapel of the funeral home. And there it is. It's the same room with the bay window. A couple other rooms in the funeral home. I'm not going to do a commercial before you're into it. They used to be the chapel, but now it's a large visitation room. So, that brings us up to date with Blevins. Golly, how long is this going on? I know it, I'm about to lose you on it. Okay. In 1917, Starkey Brothers Furniture Company in Bristol hired J.W. Huff from Latonia, Kentucky to come here and run their undertaking department. Mr. Huff moved here with his family in 1917, happened to move into a house on James Street that is next door to what was later Acre Funeral Home on James Street, but they were never there at the same time. In 1922, J.W. Huff bought the undertaking department of Starkey Brothers Furniture Company. Dr. Joseph Bunning at Bunning's Drugstore built this building and leased it to J.W. Huff. It was built as a funeral home. There's 3,000 square feet on the main floor and 3,000 square feet upstairs, and Mr. Huff and his 6 daughters and Mrs. Huff and Mr. and Miss Huff's 11-year-old farm boy nephew from Grant County, Kentucky, Paul Cook, moved into this building. Paul Cook came to Bristol just in time to help move from the house on James Street in the undertaking parlor on State Street into this building. Paul Cook lived on what was called the sleeping porch. I think it's the back porch. But he lived there and grew up there with the Huffs and their 11 daughters. I have no idea what went on in that place. What anybody saying? That's Mr. and Miss Huff right there. They were both licensed funeral director and embalmers. She was the first licensed lady embalmer in the state of Tennessee. That's 1928. I don't remember. Coaches, they're both combination cars, could be used for ambulances, hearses. These are all big old town cars, or what do they call them, touring cars. It was named, well, that's wrong. It was J.W. Huff Funeral Director. Yeah, that's right, J.W. Huff Funeral Director from 23 to 31. In 1930, Paul Cook went to a funeral home in Norfolk, Virginia to serve his apprenticeship as an embalmer. And he was 19 years old, and when he came back to Bristol, J.W. Huff was his uncle, his mother's brother. He had worked for Mr. Huff for 8 years, and apparently done a good job, because he told me when he walked up the street from the train station, he saw that the name of the business had been changed to Huff Cook Funeral Home. He's 19 years old. Can you imagine the thrill of his seeing his name on that sign? That's the best that building ever looked. And when I win the lottery, I'm going to buy it back and I'm going to make it look just like that. And Joyce and I are going to move in there. In 1940, okay, this is J.W. Huff, obviously Mary Huff and Paul Cook. And in 1939, LaSalle combination coach, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, except to me, it's sad, because to me it's sad. I don't know why it's sad to me. If it hadn't happened that way, I'd never owned a funeral home. Mr. and Miss Huff were divorced. He took over the funeral home they owned in Kingsport. She and Paul Cook owned the funeral home here in Bristol. And in 1941, he bought the funeral home on Pennsylvania Avenue, bought her interest and changed the name to Paul Cook Funeral Home. There he is on his horse-drawn hearse on Front Street. Hotel General Shelby, the Victory Grill, Service Dry Cleaners, Home Trade Shoe Store. I remember all those places, some of you do
Is this
too.
on Front Street?
That's on Front Street.
Oh, Trey's where the sausage is.
That's the Hotel General Shelby. Service, no, I mean, Home Dry Clean, I've got the names mixed up. Home Dry Cleaners,
Yeah.
Union Shoe Shop.
Okay. Cause I know Home Trade was down on, down that way.
About where, that
Where the farmer's market.
McAdoo's,
Yeah,
in
they're
there.
in there.
And there's crossings that can't.
My. That's the chapel at Paul Cook Funeral Home in 1961.
Let's give it a picture.
Polaroid land camera.
Hair change, that's it.
I heard that, John. That's, first automobile I ever drove on the streets. Isn't that a shame? That's sad. We had a funeral. We were talking about Rudy Branch at the meeting. We had a burial at Rudy Branch, and the man driving the hearse got sick, and I had to drive him back to the funeral home. Of course, I was going to have my arm out the window, and I never will forget, I was driving that thing, had a steering wheel, big old steering wheel. And I had my arm out the window about like this, and I'm driving back to Pennsylvania.
Was it a straight shit?
No, it was 1956 model, it was an automatic. No air conditioning. That was a room at Paul Cook Funeral Home on Pennsylvania Avenue after Miss Joyce redecorated the place. Paul Cook on the left, I guess you know that's him. That's about the time I bought Paul Cook Funeral Home in 1978. And that's the way it looked when I grew up there from 42 to 82 when we moved down on Volunteer Parkway. I wish I had more time, but I'm not going to take it. This was George and Ed Blevins' convenience store on the Bluff City Highway. They had gas pumps, they had rooms upstairs you could spend the night in, they had a restaurant. Around here that you can't see, they had a garage you could pull a car in to service it. That's kind of the predecessor of Sheetz or Pilot J and so forth. In this building, you can see that building right here. And that's what I bought in 1981, was this building. That was back when I was in charge. Later on, Joyce, probably because I bought that's when she decided she better be in charge. But she and my friends and family thought I lost my mind when I said I could turn that into a funeral home. But I think it made it pretty nice for the place.
George and Ed.
Go back to the.
Go back into
Go back,
the woods.
yeah. Go
What?
back a little more. Wasn't that the Moose Club? Yeah.
Yes,
I don't remember that, but I remember the Moose Club.
35, what was it, 36, 5 years ago, I wish people would forget that.
And she brought it up.
People would call down there and say, I noticed y'all got John Doe's funeral down there tomorrow. Where are you located? And I'd say, you know where the Moose Club used to be? And they'd say, yeah. I'd say, along in there. There's Paul Cook Memorial Chapel, dedicated January 10th, 1982. I think the high that day was like 5 degrees. I want to speak about this a minute. In 1993, we put in what was then and still is Bristol's only crematory at Oakley Cook Funeral Home. You can call your place Sid Oakley's cremation services, But you can only call it Oakley Cook Funeral Home and Crematory if you in fact have a crematory on the property. And I'm proud of the fact that we had the first, and surprised we still have the only one in town. But it is a first-class operation, and it was quite a leap in faith to put it in, but it's proved to be much more successful than I ever wanted it to be. I took that picture in 1960 with that same camera. I did pretty good on this one. That was Gillespie and Robinson's combination, the only car they had, which is up here on the hill. That building, it again, was St. Anne's Church. And those windows have since been purchased by St. Anne's and put in storage for what nobody knows, but I'm glad they bought them and stored them. That was what later became Robinson Mortuary. That is the St. Anne's Church and the rectory, and they joined them with sort of a foyer. Two fine gentlemen, both of whom I knew well. Pat Robinson, many of you knew, died a few years ago. Richard Clark just died last month. He worked for Pat Robinson, P.H. Robinson, for many years. Grew up there, as a matter of fact, kind of like I grew up at Paul Cook's. After Pat Robinson died, Richard moved the funeral home out on Midway Street and started R.A. Clark Mortuary Funeral Service.
What was the relationship between Gillespie and Robinson?
And they were just partners. They weren't kin.
Was it always Gillespie Robinson until Gillespie passed?
Yes. And then it was Robinson Mortuary. There, Mr. Gillespie worked for Willie Brown, who had a funeral home on Lee Street, and then he and Pat Robinson teamed up and moved into the old Catholic church rectory. And that's by the way, that's our wedding album. That's the only picture we got. I think the whole family thought John was right when he said he thought he'd last about 2 weeks, and they didn't think it was worth taking many pictures. That's our wedding picture, and that's little Sid Oakley's 50 years of funeral. And a plaque I received from the Tennessee Funeral Directors Association when I retired, and I'm just glad I lived to receive it. I'm through.